Okay, we're ready to go. This is a short test material. We talked about something that happened during the presidency of Thomas Jefferson, which was the Lewis and Clark expedition or the Corps Discovery, and I separated that a little bit so we not have confusion. Now we're going to talk about his presidency, and before we do that, we kind of got to back up politically and remind you that he took over for John Adams, right? And what did John Adams do clear up to midnight of his last day in office? He appointed a bunch of Federalist judges to federal courts around the country. Just kind of keep that in mind, because you have a Federalist president who's now replaced with a Republican president, and they do not see eye to eye. So the first subtopic under the presidency of Thomas Jefferson is congressional changes under President Jefferson. And what I'm going to do is we're going to talk about the new Congress. Now remember when we talked about Jefferson being elected, what did we tell you about the Congress? What did we talk about the majority in Congress as a result of that election? It went to the House and Senate, during that election process, went to the Republican Party. So we have a Republican-controlled Congress and a Republican president. So Jefferson's going to have it easier to convince Congress to make changes in the federal government because it's a Republican Congress. So because the new Congress was controlled by the Republican Party, President Jefferson convinces them to make several changes in the federal government. And I'm going to give you 5 changes that Jefferson convinced Congress to do early in his presidency. You might remember this. First thing Congress did is they repealed the excise tax on whiskey. Remember that? Remember when they taxed whiskey and led to the Whiskey Rebellion? Well, one of the first things Congress did under the presidency of Thomas Jefferson is they repealed that excise tax on whiskey. He thought it was unconstitutional from the start, because who would he have represented at the time? Common man or farmers. So Congress repealed the excise tax on whiskey. Now this one we'll have to talk about later. After controversy, number 2, after controversy, Congress repealed the Judiciary Act of 1801. Does anybody in here remember what the Judiciary Act of 1801 did? No, what? No, that was 1789. You're on the right track. But look in your notes, somebody, or all of you. Find out what the Judiciary Act of 1801 did. Because Congress is going to repeal this.
Oh, isn't it where... Oh, no, never mind. That was it.
Yes. No, you're a little bit behind. This was 1801 that would have been done late in Adams's term. Got it, Elise? Somebody's got to have it. Judiciary Act of 1801. Find the midnight appointments and midnight judges and find it there. We've got to be able to retain this kind of stuff. What's the Judiciary Act of 1801? What did it do? I can't imagine you guys don't have this in your notes. Why don't you have these together? Hey, go!
It's the act that increased the number of judges in the court by 60.
Right, which led to what? The midnight appointments. If we don't have the Judiciary Act of 1801, very good, that allows for those 16 judges to be added, Adams isn't adding these midnight appointments. So what is that really saying? If they repealed the Judiciary Act of 1801, wouldn't that mean that these midnight judges that were appointed by President Adams couldn't assume office? Because they repealed the law. See what he's trying to do here? And we're going to get into this more, but he convinced Congress into repealing the Judiciary Act of 1801, which meant that these midnight judges that were appointed by Adams could not take office. Okay? Now, you've got to figure out in your mind, if you're keeping up on this, something must have gone crazy, because we did have John Marshall, didn't we, as Supreme Court Justice forever? I said he was one of the most effective ones we ever had. So something must not have worked, because wasn't he one of those? Okay, we'll get to that. Okay? The third thing Congress did is they kept the National Bank of the United States. They kept it even though President Jefferson thought it was unconstitutional. So they kept it. So it really wasn't a congressional change, but do you think he wanted a change there? Do you think he wanted him to get rid of it?
Yeah.
He did, but they chose not to do that. So it's not a congressional change, but it was one he requested. So Congress kept the National Bank of the United States even though President Jefferson thought it was unconstitutional. This is kind of interesting. Finally, Congress allowed President Jefferson to order Secretary of the Treasury Albert Gallatin to use federal government money to pay off state debts. Remember that? That led to the assumption bill that somebody was alluding to the Capitol. Okay? But Congress allowed President Jefferson to order Secretary of the Treasury Albert Gallatin to use federal money to pay off those state debts that Alexander Hamilton thought was so important to keep our good credit. You remember that? Okay? So Congress allowed President Jefferson to order Secretary of the Treasury Albert Gallatin to use federal money to pay off those state debts. And this is I thought this was a little unusual, but it happened. Congress cut funding, number 5, Congress cut funding to both the Army and Navy and reduced them in size. Congress cut funding to both the Army and Navy to reduce them in size. That's going to hurt us a little bit in an upcoming conflict known as what? War of 1812. Very good. Okay, any questions on congressional changes under President Jefferson? Now, this is going to take us to a complex subtopic that we're going to have to make sure you understand, and that's John Marshall and the Supreme Court. John Marshall and the Supreme Court. So this is going to get a little kind of confusing because Congress passed to repeal the Judiciary Act of 1801. Now, let's kind of go back. After the sweeping Republican victory in the election of 1800, in which we had a Republican president elected, a Republican vice president elected, and a Republican-controlled Congress, the only power remaining to the Federalist Party was their control of the federal courts by virtue of the midnight appointments that Adams had made. Because those 16 judges that were appointed, including the new Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, were Federalist, right? And that's really the only Federalist power in the country at the time. Well, these Federalist judges that were appointed by President Adams during his midnight appointments annoyed President Jefferson immensely. Annoyed him immensely. He didn't think it was right, didn't like it, was mad about it. Very annoying to him that all of a sudden he's got 16 new Federalist judges across the country, including who? John Marshall, the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. Now this is kind of interesting. Of the 16 Federalist judges that were appointed by Adams, which one gave Jefferson the most grief? John Marshall, who ironically was his cousin. John Marshall was Thomas Jefferson's cousin. And he was the Federalist judge that caused President Jefferson the most grief. His cousin, Chief Justice John Marshall. Now, this is where I gotta make sure you understand, but we gotta pay attention. The first major Supreme Court case that was decided by John Marshall put him in direct conflict with President Jefferson. So the very first case that John Marshall and the Supreme Court are going to rule on is going to put him in direct conflict with President Jefferson. Now, obviously, I want you to think about this. When President Jefferson took office, did he want to block the Federalist judges appointed by President Adams? He sure did, because he talked Congress into repealing what? The Judiciary Act of 1801. So he definitely wanted to block those appointments. He did not want those federal judges to take office. Now, in order for these Federalist judges to grant power, to give them the power to be judges, they had to be given commissions. Okay, they had to be given commissions. So if Peyton Woofington was chosen by President Dewar to be a federal court judge in the midnight appointments, how he gets his power to be that judge, or how he gets to have that job, is he's going to receive a commission from the Secretary of State. And a commission simply an order that grants him power. So it's kind of like, before I can be a teacher in Wyoming, I have to have a Wyoming teaching license, right? And the Wyoming Professional Teacher Standard Board, after I apply, they send me a license. And then I show it to the central office and they say, hey, you have power to teach now at Worland High School. That is an order granting you power to be a teacher. So what Jefferson did is he ordered the Secretary of State, which remember was who? James Madison, not to deliver the commissions to these Federalist judges that were appointed by Adams. He says, we're not going to give them that teaching license. And that way they can't what? Teach. I'm not going to give them that judge license or that power. That way they will not be able to assume office. So that's how Jefferson was going to block Federalist judges that were appointed by President Adams. He simply was going to order his Secretary of State, James Madison, not to deliver those commissions to those judges. And without the commissions, Emily, they could not what? They couldn't have power to be judges. Well, one of these Federalist judges that did not receive their commission or their power was William Marbury. William Marbury was one of these judges, of these 16, that did not receive their commission or their order granting power from James Madison. So he's mad about it, so what does he do? He sues the federal government. Okay? He sues the federal government. He wanted his commission. He sued for it. I deserve it. I was appointed by the president. You have no right not to give me my commission. I am suing the federal government for my commission. Well, that case went all the way to the Supreme Court. And it's called Marbury versus Madison. Marbury being the man that didn't receive his commission, and Madison being what, Elise?
Madison, it was the one who's the Secretary of State, right?
Who didn't give him his commission. So he's basically suing the Secretary of State for not giving him his commission. So this Supreme Court ruling will be known as Marbury versus Madison, and it went to the Supreme Court in 1803. 1803 is when the Supreme Court heard this. So obviously it went through local and federal courts, right? And they appealed it all the way to the Supreme Court because Marbury didn't get the decision he wanted at the local courts, right? So he appealed all the way to the Supreme Court, and they heard it in 1803. Well, guess who was presiding over the Supreme Court at this time? John Marshall. Keep that in mind. But what he does might surprise you. First thing that Justice Marshall ruled is that Marbury had the right to his commission according to the Judiciary Act of 1789. Now, the Judiciary Act of 1801 just called for 16 more federal judges. The Judiciary Act of 1789, which set up the court system, is the one that said, if you get a commission, you get to be the power. Does that make sense to you? So, the 1789 Act gave the commission part of it power. The Judiciary Act of 1801 simply added 16 more. So, first thing that Justice Marshall rules is that according to the Judiciary Act of 1789, which set up our court system in the United States, Marbury had the right to his commission. However, the second thing he rules is kind of interesting. He ruled that the Judiciary Act of 1789 gave the Supreme Court more power than the Constitution allowed. So he ruled that the Judiciary Act of 1789 gave the Supreme Court more power than the Constitution had allowed. So if he says that the Judiciary Act of 1789 gave the Supreme Court more power than the Constitution allowed, McKenna, my dear, what does that make the Judiciary Act of 1789? Gave it too much power, gave it more power than the Constitution allowed, so it must be what? Constitutional. If it gave more power than the Constitution allowed, it's unconstitutional, right? It's not legal. So if you look at this, if the Judiciary Act of 1789 is unconstitutional, and that act gave Marbury his commission, then what happens to Marbury's commission? It goes away. So even though he ruled that the Judiciary Act of 1789 gave Marbury his commission, he also ruled that it was unconstitutional, which meant if it's against the law, he cannot have his commission. You see what I mean by that? Now, did he lose support within his own party, the Federalists? He sure did, but he accomplished a much larger, long-term judicial victory for this country. And I'm going to explain that to you. That's why Marbury versus Madison is so important. So even though he sacrificed a small Federalist gain by denying this commission on Marbury, he did gain a much larger long-term judicial victory. Had there ever been an act of Congress ruled unconstitutional prior to this in our country's history? No. So by ruling an act of Congress unconstitutional, and the act of Congress was passing the Judiciary Act of 1789, Marshall establishes what we know in government as the doctrine of judicial review. Judicial review. And I'll explain this to you so you understand. So we've never once had a Supreme Court rule that something was unconstitutional that was set up. This is the first time that we have a ruling of unconstitutional by an act of Congress. So what Marshall establishes is what we know as the doctrine of judicial review. So what judicial review does is it takes away power from Congress. In other words, prior to this, if Congress passed it, it was what? Law. Nobody questioned it. Well, with this ruling by John Marshall, he establishes judicial review, which means what body from this point on is going to judge what Congress does, either constitutional or non-constitutional. Or the biggest one is called the Supreme Court. So what this act does, what this decision does in American history, is it establishes judicial review. And for the first time in history, laws passed by Congress will be looked at, will be reviewed by the judicial system, the Supreme Court, and determine whether that law is what? Constitutional or non-constitutional. So the Supreme Court could now overrule actions of either the House or the Senate. Now I want to make sure you understand that, so let's kind of review that and we'll talk about it again. So, Thomas Jefferson is mad about the Judiciary Act of 1801. He does not want the 16 newly appointed federal judges, who are all Federalists, to take office. So what he does, by virtue of the Judiciary Act of 1789, that you get a commission which gives you power to be a federal judge. And who gives you that commission? The Secretary of State, according to the Judiciary Act of 1789. President Jefferson tells Secretary of State James Madison, do not deliver any of those commissions, because if you don't deliver them, they can't take power. So, Secretary of State Madison does what the President says, and one of those 16 judges, William Marbury, says, hey, that's a bunch of BS. I deserve that commission according to the Judiciary Act of 1789, and I'm going to sue the federal government to get it back. So it goes all the way to the Supreme Court. It's called Marbury versus Madison. It happens in 1803. Chief Justice John Marshall rules, number one, that you know what? According to the Judiciary Act of 1789, by God, William Marbury does deserve that commission. The problem is, the Judiciary Act of 1789, in my opinion, is unconstitutional. Therefore, Marbury will not get his commission. And what he does is he sacrifices Federalist power, which is his own party, right, in exchange for establishing something called judicial review, what puts Congress on notice that somebody's paying attention to what you're passing and making a decision whether it's right, constitutionally, or wrong, unconstitutionally. And that body is the Supreme Court. That's a crucial decision in American history, and I would be shocked if you didn't see that on an AP test next year, to explain Marbury versus Madison. So keep that one horribly highlighted, because I will guarantee you that'll be on this test and the semester exam. Guaranteed. Okay? So if you have any questions about that, review the video or come see me. That's a really crucial Supreme Court decision that you need to understand. Okay, that'll take us to our last subtopic of the day, which is judicial impeachments under Thomas Jefferson. Judicial impeachments under Thomas Jefferson. Well, Jefferson knows that he's got issues with the Federalist Party, and he's going to try another method to overturn any Federalist measures